The guillotine stands as the epitome of capital punishment in Galt. Yet despite its heinous reputation, most citizens consider it a clean and efficient means of political execution, at least compared to the other options. Behold the Torn Quartet, an undead monster centered around the idea of someone who was drawn and quartered. Paizo, this is sadistic and hilarious. I can't wait to torment my players with it. By the way, yes, I do love the ability Replacement Parts. Today, we're going to talk about the new book for the Golarion campaign setting, Lost Omens, Shining Kingdoms, on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello, travelers and tourists. My name is Mark, and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that was not anticipating so much crossover content with the Book of the Dead. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome to a storyteller's review of Lost Omens, Shining Kingdoms. Now, up front, I do need to let you know that Paizo did send me a review PDF of this book, so thank you to Paizo for providing that to me. Paizo did not attempt to influence this review in any way, shape, form, or fashion. The thoughts expressed in this video are entirely my own, but please be aware that Paizo did provide the review PDF for this video to be made. Lost Omens, Shining Kingdoms is the latest in the Lost Omens line, a series of setting books for the Golarion campaign setting, which is the default setting for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and the TLDW of Lost Omens Shining Kingdoms is that this section of the Golarion campaign setting kind of serves as their standard fantasy trope section of the map. We'll talk about this more in depth here in a moment, but when you think about a lot of the classic tropes associated with fantasy TTRPGs, noble knights, evil villains, elves and dwarves, things like that, essentially this is that section of the map, but with a Paizo twist. Now, that being said, that Paizo twist does show that classic tropes are classic for a reason, and I think that Paizo has done a pretty good job helping to demonstrate, well, why the classics are worth considering for your own table's TTRPG sessions. So in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about how Lost Omens Shining Kingdoms is structured. I'm going to talk a little bit about the content that you can expect to find in there, both from the Game Master and player side of the screen. And new to my book reviews on this channel, I want to take a look at this product from a storytelling perspective. Essentially, I want to ask the question, if you pick this book up, what kind of stories are you supporting, and what kind of stories can you and your friends build together with this content? In particular, in this video, I plan on diving a little bit deeper into the chapter on Galt, because honestly, it's my favorite chapter in this book, and there's just a lot of fun stuff in there. I'll give a broad overview of the various items you can expect to find, but I want to use the chapter on Galt to help give you a taste of how Paizo approached this book, so that you can get an idea of what to expect if you pick this product up. Now, of course, as with any review that I do on this channel, please remember that the best review of any product is always to try something for yourself before you buy it. So I do strongly encourage you, if you can borrow this book from a friend or check it out at a fine local gaming store, that is always going to give you the best idea of whether or not this product is right for you. However, all that being said, I've seen a lot of commentary on this product around YouTube, and glancing through it myself, I think Paizo's delivered a pretty strong product here, and I think there's a lot of fun stuff that is worth exploring. So let's dive in and see what Paizo has to offer in Lost Omens Shining Kingdoms. Now, one thing I want to note really quick before we dive into the content of the books, the Lost Omens Shining Kingdoms is going to come with a map that is included as part of this product, and I'm always a fan of maps. I've got a few different Golarion maps hanging around my game room, so I'm always glad to see something like this included, so just be aware that that is part of this product. However, in glancing at the table of contents, we can get a quick idea for the structure of this book and what you can expect inside of it. It's going to give us an introduction to the Shining Kingdoms. It's going to talk about the history of the Shining Kingdoms. They have some fantastic timelines that are worth digging through in this book. They'll give you an idea of what the Shining Kingdoms are like at present in the Golarion setting, and then you're going to get a section on the people or different ancestries you might see in the Shining Kingdom, the beliefs, especially the predominant religions and religious groups that you might encounter, and then finally some of the major and minor factions that operate in the Shining Kingdoms. That is essentially going to cover about the first 28-29 pages of the book, and then you move into 6 chapters that are going to be themed around the major countries that are in this section of Golarion. First up is Andoran, then Druma, the Five Kings Mountains, Galt, Kyonin, and Taldor. And then finally, you have a bestiary at the end that offers some regionally themed monsters that game masters might want to take advantage of. The country-focused chapters are the core of this book, and where you can expect the majority of the content to be found, and each chapter is organized in a pretty predictable way. It begins with the history of that country. It talks about some of the current events, some of the notable figures, the Gazetter, or essentially some of the interesting places you can go. Then each chapter is going to have a few pages dedicated to a major city or settlement inside of that country. So for example, for the nation of Galt, you get a discussion of the capital city of Isarn. And then finally, at the end of every chapter, you're going to have options for that chapter, and you might as well call that the player character options. So the Galt options are going to be options that PCs from the region of Galt might find compelling or might want to use. And essentially every single country is going to be organized the same way, so you get that same treatment for Andoran, Kyonin, all of them. You have that general outline, that general approach. Some of them may have more player character options, some may have a bit fewer, but all of the options are pretty cool, and I think there's a lot of fun stuff in here. So every single chapter definitely has something that is a selling point. Now, I will say, just in regards to the overall structure of this book, I do have one mild complaint, and if you saw my reviews of the Tianxia World Guide and Character Guide, you probably know what complaint is coming here, and that is, well, with the Tianxia guides, you had one book, the World Guide, that was focused pretty much exclusively on the Game Master side of the screen, and then you had the Character Guide, which was focused more on what player characters might want to know, or more appropriately, what character options that PCs might want to incorporate into their build. You had 2 different books that were intended for 2 different sides of the screen, and having seen that approach with the Tianxia World Guide and Character Guide, I am a little bit sad that Paizo didn't do the same thing here. I realize that the Shining Kingdoms is a smaller region, and so it's a little bit harder to develop that much content, but I do think it's a little bit problematic when you have Game Master focused content mixed in with PC focused content. If I was giving my players the section on Galt, I would essentially be saying, okay, turn to page 122 and please ignore most of the stuff before that page because I don't want you looking at my campaign notes. That is overall a relatively minor criticism of this book, but I did want to point it out. At the end of the day, there is a lot of great content about this section of the Golarion campaign setting, and whether you are a game master or a player, I think you're going to find some stuff in this book that is incredibly compelling. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to go to the how to use this book section of the book, because one of my goals in my book reviews is I want to move to a more storytelling focused review of products, and I want to ask the question, how does Paizo intend for us to use this book? What can we get out of this book? What kind of stories does this book foster at our gaming tables? And I have to say that Paizo actually answers that very directly. There is a sidebar very early on in the book, this is found on page 8, where they say explicitly, "The Shining Kingdoms are a traditional high fantasy setting filled with honorable knights, grand adventures, and ancient evils. The nations in this book easily fit into different types of campaigns." So Paizo, essentially from the word go, says, this is your traditional fantasy tropes book. When you think about traditional fantasy TTRPGs, traditional fantasy storytelling, a lot of the tropes that we kind of associate with the game, Paizo has baked into this particular region in their setting. Again, honorable knights, grand adventures, ancient evils. There's literally a nation of elves and a nation of dwarves in this book. I'm not going to be digging into those two particular chapters, but there's a lot of fun stuff in those chapters. Paizo made a conscious decision when designing this region of their game to say, hey, these are some of the core tropes of fantasy TTRPGs. These are some of the things you can very naturally expect to see in your typical Pathfinder game, in your typical Dungeons & Dragons game, or whatever other fantasy TTRPG you might be playing. There's certain tropes that a lot of people who are coming to this game kind of expect to see. And Paizo said, okay, if they expect to see them, we're going to put them in there. And if you were to go further down this sidebar, you see that they spend a lot of time discussing what some of these tropes are. You know, Andoran is a nation that is battling against the tyranny of Cheliax. Galt is focused on intrigue associated with the numerous revolutions that have shaken that country. The nation of Druma deals with issues like the corrupting power of wealth. And as I've already said, you have Paizo's take on the traditional elves and dwarves that you see in a lot of fantasy literature. There are so many tropes that we expect to see, and Paizo just kind of says, okay, here they are, we're putting them front and center, and we're building them into this section of our setting. If you are interested in those tropes, even in passing, Lost Omens Shining Kingdoms has a lot to offer you. However, I do think there is a danger that comes with a product like this, and it's worth taking a moment to discuss, in that, well, I'm using the word tropes to discuss this book, and tropes can very easily become a negative connotation for storytelling because, well, if you get a character that's locked into a trope, it can become too predictable. It can potentially fall a little flat as a result. Trope-based storytelling is tricky to do. You like having the tropes because knowing what to expect helps to ground someone in the world, especially if they're a new player in the game, but by the same token, if you lean too heavily on those tropes, you run the very real risk of stealing the impact that the story could have. So, Paizo tells us up front that this is where a lot of your traditional fantasy storytelling elements are going to be found, but we do need to ask the question, are the tropes handled well? Are the classics truly classic, or are they a little bit bland? I'm gonna be honest and say, I think Paizo has shown that they know how to take classic storytelling and pull out the pieces that are really worth enjoying and use that to build something fun. My overall impression of this book is Paizo showed us why the classics earned that status, and if you're a fan of traditional high fantasy storytelling, you're gonna see it done well in this book. Paizo certainly has the tropes, but they've definitely taken their own spin on it, And again, I'm not going to be diving into the chapter on elves for this particular review, but as many reviewers have pointed out, elves and Galarian are actually aliens, and Paizo has a good time with that story concept. So, while the high fantasy tropes are there, Paizo has definitely taken their own spin on this product, and I think they've offered a lot of great stuff as a result. Now, if you're a game master, there is one section of this book that is definitely something you're going to want to spend some time looking at, and that is the Bestiary for the Shining Kingdoms. It starts off with this section, offering a, quote, non-exhaustive list of creatures both revered and feared by the inhabitants of the Shining Kingdom, and you can get a quick list of a lot of the different monsters that can fit well in a campaign that would be set in any of these particular nations. So, if you're interested in the Shining Kingdoms and you're wondering what to use, there's a convenient list of things you could drop into the game quite easily and where to find them. However, they also have a number of monsters that are unique to the Shining Kingdoms and really help to capture some of the major themes associated with the locations and stories associated with this book. A good example is the Orrisrath, which is an undead creature associated with greed. When an individual dies surrounded by masses of wealth, greed can even reanimate the dead, sufficient avarice can anchor the deceased soul to their body, and here you have an undead creature that is associated with the concept of greed and the concept of wealth and the weight that it places on their soul. If you enjoy the storytelling associated with Druma, this is a perfect monster for capturing that kind of story, and it even comes with an interesting ability called Fetters of Debt that plays right into that theme. Another monster I really enjoy is the Bibliodaemon, which is a four-armed weasel-like daemon who personifies death by paperwork. Oh my gosh, there's so many stories from 2021 I can't tell in this video, but believe me, I think I've encountered one of these creatures. But far and away, my favorite creature presented in this section is the one that I teased in the opening of this video, the Torn Quartet, which is an undead creature associated with someone who was drawn and quartered. A Torn Quartet appears as four floating pieces of a humanoid cadaver tethered together with ropes of spectral energy that each sport a single limb. I love the artwork on this creature. I cannot wait to throw one of these at my players. I think this is just the right blend of creepy and cool, and we're going to be talking about Galt here in a moment, where political executions have been a thing for a long time in that part of the setting. So this monster is just a perfect fit to that setting. The Bestiary in this book has some pretty fun options that game masters are definitely going to want to drop in their games, especially if they're set in the Shining Kingdoms. Now, I don't want to go into every country in depth because this video would be super long, but just to give you a quick idea of what the sections look like, every country that is covered is going to open in a similar fashion. You're going to have a 2-page spread that's going to have some artwork that is appropriate to that country. You're going to see some basic information about the nation, what their capital is, the type of government, their ruler. You get a list of peoples, some of the common languages, factions that are going to be important in this area. You're going to see a quick description of some of the major religions and some of the major resources that are associated with that. And you'll also get a map that kind of digs in a little bit more and gives you some more detail about that country. So this 2-page spread was for the nation of Andoran. You get the same thing for the Oligarchy of Druma. You also have a chapter for the Five Kings Mountains, covering the various governments associated with dwarves. You also get a look at Kyonin, which is the home of the elves. You get a look at the ancient empire of Taldor. And as we're going to be focusing on in this book, here we have a 2-page breakdown of Galt. The capital of Galt is the town of Isarn. It's ruled by a council. We'll talk about that in a moment. And its current ruler is Citizen Camelia Dranak. You have a short list of peoples and languages, and this is a very interesting list of peoples: halflings, humans, and undead. So this is why, I'll go ahead and tell you, this is why I'm focusing on this chapter for this review. I guess I knew that there would be some undead in Galt because of the endless revolutions that they've gone through, and some of the stories surrounding the final blades that were recently destroyed. It doesn't surprise me that undead were here, but Paizo actually dug a little bit deeper into the concept of the undead and gave us some interesting story options. Early on in Pathfinder 2e, before the remaster happened, there was this fun book called Book of the Dead that gave options for playing undead PCs, and I wasn't expecting to see that kind of content show back up in this book, but it makes sense, and honestly, it's a lot of fun. This section talks about some of the factions, the Broken Ghosts, the Firebrands, the Pathfinder Society. It gives a quick snapshot of some of the religions that you can find in this area, and again, some of the major resources. And of course, as I mentioned, you have a detailed map of the area that you can reference as you're kind of reading through this section. So, in the Golarion campaign setting, Galt is reminiscent in some ways of the real-world history of the French Revolution. And some of the stories that came out of the French Revolution, both some of the high points and some of the terrible low points that major revolutions might cause. Galt used to be a vassal state of the Chalaxian Empire, but eventually they earned their freedom and attempted to make their own way on the face of Golarion, and unfortunately, that didn't go well. A series of just repeated revolutions and overthrown governments took over in Galt, and you just kind of have these stories of one revolution after another, one demagogue and one fiery diatribe after another, and a group of people constantly being whipped into a frenzy, sometimes not being aware of what the consequences of that frenzy was going to be. You had a group that came to power called the Grey Gardeners that used these guillotines called the Final Blades that not just killed people in political executions, but actually trapped their souls. And this caused the nation of Galt to fall under some pretty dark and terrible things as a result, and not surprisingly, it was eventually revealed that the Grey Gardeners were not exactly good guys, that they were helping to foment a lot of these revolutions, and they had some pretty dark motives as a result. I don't want to go into all of that story beats. There's an adventure, I think it's called The Night of the Grey Death, where you can find out about the fall of the Grey Gardeners and the destruction of the Final Blades. But essentially, this ongoing revolution was leading to some pretty terrible places. Some adventurers, thankfully, prevented the worst from coming to pass, but you still have this nation that is suffering from all of these revolutions that have occurred, and that is still teetering on the edge of a new revolution. In each chapter, you'll get a history that talks about the timeline of that given nation. So in this instance, we have a history of Galt that goes back roughly 4,600 years. And it kind of moves through all of the major events, major councils, political figures, things like that. Events that would have helped shape the history of Galt and the people who live in that region. And the history section will ultimately lead up to the current events, the things that are currently happening in this portion of the setting. So the current events for Galt, in the months immediately following the Night of Grey Death, one of the most daunting challenges faced by First Citizen Camellia Dranok and the People's Council was convincing the people of Galt that the Red Revolution had finally and truly ended. And that's where a lot of the present stories are kind of building from in this section of the world. Again, Paizo does a good job of giving you the current events for each of the countries featured in this book. It'll go into some of the notable figures, and they give you some pretty good artwork to go along with these figures. So as a storyteller, you have some NPCs that are available that you can use and that you can drop into the game. So for example, up here we have the character of Madeline Talbot, and they give you a little bit of history of Madeline. In this case, we get a description that she is a remorseful female human vigilante, and she was part of a family that believed in the righteousness of the Grey Gardener's cause, only to suffer a crisis of faith when the Grey Gardener's evil intentions were exposed. So this is one character that you could potentially drop into your story, and I highlight Madeline to highlight one of the themes that runs through the section on Galt, which is this concept of vigilantism. Galt, as a nation associated with so many revolutions, is a place where vigilantism, for better or worse, has run rampant over the years, and vigilante-style characters are a major theme associated with this section of the world. For example, the Red Raven is actually the iconic vigilante for Pathfinder 2e, and they're from this region. Next up, you have a Gazetter, which is sort of a list of major locations that players might want to travel to. So different places around Galt that could serve as a staging ground for adventures for your PCs to go on. The Gazetter in each section is ultimately going to lead into a major settlement or city that is detailed for that given country. In the case of the nation of Galt, we have Isarn, which is the capital of Galt and home to the Reconciliation Council that is trying to bring the nation out of this cycle of terrible revolutions. You get a settlement breakdown associated with whatever location is being detailed. So here we get all of the critical details of Isarn, and I like the way the city stat blocks are done. One of the things they point out for Isarn is this special trait that Isarn has called anonymity. Thanks to decades of administrative negligence and deeply entrenched reluctance on the part of its citizens to cooperate with authority, Isarn is an excellent place to disappear or become someone else. By spending 24 hours and bribes totaling at least 100 GP per character level, increased at GM discretion as appropriate, you can obtain forged documents and pay off the right locals necessary to create a new social identity with the effects of the vigilante archetype dedication. There's another shout out to the vigilante stuff that I mentioned a moment ago. This particular social identity is only usable inside of Isarn, and if you are actually a vigilante, you can have another separate social identity that's associated with that archetype. But I think it's really cool that they have a mechanic for this settlement that's literally vanish into the crowd. And again, they do stuff like this for at least one major settlement in every single country. So there's a lot of stuff that game masters can really sink their teeth into with the Shining Kingdoms book. Of course, the settlement will get a map and a gazetteer of some of the significant locations inside that particular settlement. All of this taken together is essentially game master oriented content, representing different hooks and different things that a storyteller might use to build up a campaign, or at least a portion of a campaign that you can then run your players through. The majority of every chapter is really geared towards the game master, but at the end of every chapter, you get options that are specific to that region, and these options are very much your player character oriented content. So while the majority of this book is definitely centered on what game masters will want to know and use, players definitely have some fun stuff that they can take advantage of as well. So for the Nation of Galt, what they did in the player character options, and why I absolutely love this book, they went hard into undead options and things that are themed around the final blades that have only recently been destroyed in the setting. The first section covers ghost feats. So the ghost archetype is a special option found on pages 46 and 47 of the Book of the Dead. Paizo hasn't announced that they're doing a remaster yet. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a remaster coming in a year or two on that book, but the Book of the Dead is still completely usable. So if you're interested in using Book of the Dead content, and in particular the ghost archetype from that book, you have new options that are explicitly designed for use with the ghost archetype. In particular here, we have an ability called Headless Haunt, where since you lost your head, probably at one of those Final Blade guillotines, you have the ability to just take your head off and set it down somewhere, and that might, well, there's a lot of shenanigans you can get into if you can remove your head from your body. I think you can see how PCs could have a lot of fun with this. Another ghost option that they have is called Klingengeist. At least I think that's how you say it. It's a level 10 feat once per day, where essentially, because you were once imprisoned inside of a Final Blade, you know how to possess weapons. You can possess a weapon that deals slashing damage, give it a fly speed, and essentially you become a haunted sword that can then fly around the battlefield and attack people. That is such a fun character option. I absolutely love it. And, that's completely skipping over Fling Head down here. Or Ghostly Condemnation. There's a lot of fun ghost-centered feats that player characters can potentially take advantage of, and the idea of playing one of these spirits that was freed from these Final Blades, that's actually a really interesting character concept, and it's not one I would have thought of, but now it's something that I think could be a lot of fun to play. So if you're interested in playing a ghost, the Nation of Galt is actually a really good place to portray that kind of character. And speaking of ghosts and the Final Blades, there are a couple of new... do we call them animal companions? There's a couple new animal companions. The Severed Head Undead Companion and the Grey Bladeling, which is this little humanoid construct composed of razor-sharp blades, probably splinters from those Final Blades. Both of these are incredibly creepy, and I love them, and I guarantee you that at least 3 of my players are going to try to adopt them in an upcoming game. Then it has a section on magic items, and in this section on magic items, they really dive into the lingering impact of the Final Blades. You have the Jorngarl's Harm, which is a great axe that was crafted out of an old Final Blade, and then you have an item called a Splinter of Finality, which is a tiny shard of a Final Blade that you can deliberately insert into your deck, and Paizo, you're giving me the heebie-jeebies. But if you do this, you have the effect of the Final Blade, and you can also take a special archetype that develops the powers of that Splinter of Finality that you have embedded into your body. The core of this archetype centers around the Spectral Dagger feat, which comes in at level 2, and essentially what the Spectral Dagger feat is going to do is give you the ability to summon a +1 Ghost Touch dagger that you can just pop into your hands whenever you need it, and then a lot of your other feats are going to, in one way or another, improve what you can do with this Ghost Blade. So, for example, as an 18th level feat, you have Guillotine Blade, which can give your Spectral Dagger a Vorpal rune. Yes, they went there. Another cool option from this archetype artifact is the level 8 feat Soul Well, where essentially you can create this sort of gravitational pull for souls, making it where ghosts struggle to escape from your aura, but it can also have a positive impact. If one of your allies has the dying condition, they actually die at dying 5 rather than dying 4 because the pull of this soul well keeps their soul from leaving their body. So that's actually a really fun and flavorful ability that can both be used offensively against hostile ghosts, but also might be used to save one of your allies who's in a desperate situation. So as you can see, they have some serious fun with the idea of headless ghosts and their impact on the culture in and around Galt, and every single nation featured in this book, Paizo goes into some pretty fun depth, giving both storytellers and players a lot of just really enjoyable content that they can use. So, from a storytelling perspective, what can you expect from Lost Omens Shining Kingdom? Well, like I said, this is Paizo's take on the high fantasy classics for TTRPGs. noble knights, grand adventures, terrible evils, and the kind of stories that feel at home in most of your standard fantasy TTRPGs. Paizo has taken the classics, given it their own spin, and presented them in a way that, honestly, I think is a lot of fun. I'll go ahead and tell you, if you want to check out some more content around Lost Omens Shining Kingdoms, I've seen some really good videos from both NoNap1's and the channel Cyprime Productions, so I would encourage you to check both of those channels out. There's some really good content on both of those, but I think whether you're a game master or a player, you're going to find some stuff that you can really dig into in this book. And obviously, I haven't even touched 5 of the 6 countries that are covered here. Paizo did a fantastic job with all of them, so I think this is definitely a product that's worth checking out. But the time has come to turn the conversation over to you. Have you read Lost Omens Shining Kingdom? If so, what are your thoughts about this book? Do you think that Paizo has approached the classics in an excellent way? Or do you think that this book is buried under the weight of its own tropes? If you haven't had a chance to look at this book yet, do you have any questions about this product? Feel free to throw those down in the comments, and I'll be glad to answer them as best I can. Again, I want to say thank you to Paizo for sending me the review PDF of this product. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I'll go ahead and say, as kind of a capstone to this review, that I'm very much looking forward to picking up my own physical copy of this book. I don't have a physical copy yet. I'll probably get a physical copy at Gen Con, but I definitely know that this is one that I want to have in my collection, and I think Paizo did a pretty good job here. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, or what you want to know about this product. And before you leave, don't forget to do all the other stuff that helps support this channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of those links will be in the video description below. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.